Our guest today is a high-tech product manager, member of the UNC MBA class of 2015, and host of the MBA School podcast, and author of the book MBA Insider: How to Make the Most of Your MBA Experience. Join us for this conversation about life in the post-MBA, but not post-COVID world.
Welcome to Admission Straight Talk, the podcast dedicated to graduate admissions and helping you approach the application process thoughtfully and successfully. Your host is Accepted's founder and world-renowned admissions guru, Linda Abraham. At Accepted, our mission is to get you to that unforgettable moment when you read your acceptance email and shout, "Yes, I'm in!" Confident you'll be attending the perfect program to help you launch the career of your dreams.
Welcome to the 404th episode of Admission Straight Talk. Thanks for joining me. We're going to touch on the MBA application process during the interview, but to distill the process down to its essence, you need to show that you both fit in at your target schools and stand out in the applicant pool. You can learn how to do exactly that with Accepted's free guide, Fitting In and Standing Out, the paradox at the heart of admissions. Master this paradox, and you are well on your way to acceptance. Download it for free at accepted.com/FISO, as in fitting in, standing out. Our guest today, Al D., earned his bachelor's in marketing and theology from Boston College in 2010, and then became a Deloitte analyst and consultant until starting his MBA at UNC's Ken Flagler Business School. He earned his MBA from Ken Flagler in 2015 and returned to Deloitte for a couple of years. He started in product management then for a leading high-tech firm in 2017, and today is a senior manager in product marketing at that company. On the side, he launched his website, MBA Schooled, in 2015, and about a year ago, he published his first book, MBA Insider: How to Make the Most of Your MBA Experience, and also started the MBA Schooled podcast. Al, welcome to Admissions Straight Talk.
Thank you, Linda. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, and thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to chat with you more today.
Pleasure. It's about a year since you were last on Admissions Straight Talk, and we discussed in that interview your application experience and your MBA experience at UNC. So I'm not going to cover those topics again. We're going to discuss other topics. Listeners, however, if you would like to hear Al's perspective on the topics I typically discuss, please go to accepted.com/350 or to our show notes for this show at accepted.com/404, because we'll link to the previous show. Now let's get to the questions for today. Al, you're working in high tech in the Bay Area. I assume you're working remotely because of COVID. How did you adjust to remote work, both personally and as a manager?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the first thing I would say is that, particularly as someone who works, as a knowledge worker, right, and working, for a tech company, relatively speaking, while we've all experienced challenges, my experience making the transition was rather seamless. Many of my people on my team have worked remote for varying degrees of time. And in some cases, many are just remote based off of where they are geographically speaking. And so it wasn't so much that we hadn't done this before. We just all hadn't done it permanently before. And so it was really just about maybe refining and getting used to just this being an everyday thing. That said, even though we did have incredible resources to make the transition, even though we had some kind of norms for knowing how to collaborate over Google Hangouts and Google Meets and the like, it definitely was still challenging. Anytime you get a shock to the system where you have to make an adjustment, it takes the body a little bit of time to kind of adapt and evolve. And so I think for me, a couple things that kind of stood out. So number one, the fundamentals and the ways of working. So fundamentals, these are the things that are critical to helping you be at your best and do your job effectively. So what I mean by that is, if I think about a professional athlete, right? If I think of someone like LeBron James is amazing on the court because of all the things he does off the court in order for him to be at his best. And so I think that was something that I took to heart as I made the transition to working more remote and thought about, for the folks on my team, right? So what are those fundamentals that in this new environment, we need to make sure we focus on so that we can do the best we possibly can each and every day. And it was going to be different because the environment was different. And then the second thing was really thinking about the ways of working. And these are kind of the things that you sometimes take for granted when you're working in an office every day. The ability to pop over to someone's desk and say, "Hey, what about that thing in that meeting that we talked about? Can you just follow up real quick? Or being able to be, in my case, go to the coffee bar to catch up with someone and to have that chat about what's going on and whatnot. And so those we paid attention to as well, and thought about how do we reenact those, because many of us are, all of us are, as humans, are social beings, and those are really critical and important. And so I think those were the things that I paid attention to, that I asked my team to pay attention to try to do the best we could. Because while we, like I said, we're very fortunate, it still is hard to make a change like that, no matter how many resources or how much you have at your disposal. But those were the things that we focused on.
How did you, it's kind of interesting because Accepted has been a remote, entirely virtual company
Mm-hmm.
since inception.
Yeah.
It just worked for me. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is challenging to have the kind of casual encounters or that make for a good team experience. So how did you encourage that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a couple things. Number one, we are fortunate in that we have a lot of technology resources at our disposal, maybe too many at times. You can make the argument for that. But it can be little things as just having a channel or a thread on whatever collaboration tool of choice, just to talk about what is everyone watching right now, or what's a book recommendation, or what's a Netflix recommendation. It could be as little as at being able to, and this has happened a couple times on our team, our leader reaching out and say, hey, everyone, take care of yourself today, go and expense pick a delivery meal of some sort, right? And tell everyone what you ordered, right? It can be things like just proactively scheduling time just to check in with someone to see how they're, and no agenda, but just how are you doing? How are you feeling? And I can't remember. I'm always someone who asks, how are you doing? But during the first couple of months of the pandemic, I always made it very clear before I started any meeting is to ask someone, no, like, I don't like, how are you doing? And those are little things that may seem trivial, but I've found from my experience, people appreciate them, but also they give you a little bit of boost, and they give you a little bit of feeling like you are on a team with other people who want to work hard, but also care about you and trying to help you do your best work. And I think those are the things. And certainly we had our virtual happy hours, and we, on our broader organization at one point, we actually did have a virtual Olympics of sorts, where we had virtual competitions and things, or we had like a virtual scavenger hunt and things like that. And I think part of it, for me at least, is just getting people to come together to do something that makes them feel like they're a valued member of the team. And it could be just something small, like just a thread or a chat, or it could be something like a virtual Olympics. But I think recreating that team environment is it's hard to do, but when you can do it, it's better than nothing. I mean, I think it's hard to replicate everything from the office,
Right.
but yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We had so we use Slack,
Yep.
and one of the consultants said, I think we should be able to talk about non-work stuff.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It was a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes somebody will share vacation pictures.
Right.
This is before COVID, but even during COVID, there's been some people have gone on vacation.
Sure.
Or grandchild pictures in my case, or
Of course.
whatever it is. And it makes such a difference. Or one consultant shared a picture of her little boy going off to his first day of school. It was
Sure.
adorable. It was wonderful.
It is. And I think what you're articulating, which I really have always believed, is that who you are shows, like, yes, like when you're in a meeting, sometimes there's a persona that you have to put on to, speak articulately, to make points, or to project confidence in those things. But who you are shows up, right, in who you are at work, and who you are as a person is going to show up in your work life. And I think for folks who weren't able to do that before, I'm fortunate that I was able to do that. I'm on a team that is very inclusive, that is very accepting of others, and really encourages people to be their full selves. But there really wasn't any other way to not do that, given the fact that, as everyone has kind of documented, like your work life and your personal life was wedged together when you're literally working from home, and you got
Right.
little ones running around, or little creatures running around, or other things happening. And I hope that this gave everyone a little bit of chance to recognize the humanity that exists in all of us, hopefully. But I too appreciate the photos of the dogs and the grandkids, and anything else for that matter. It always brightens up my day.
Right. Now, do you think your MBA education assisted you in adapting to this new environment? And if so, how?
Yeah. Working in a large company like I do, and also working in a role like mine, which is incredibly cross-functional, which means when I work on a project, I'm usually never doing it alone. I'm working with a lot of people. That is critical, to have good communication, an ability to work well with others, an ability to drive towards an outcome. That's critical when you're in person. That becomes even more critical when you're all virtual and all remote. And the running joke is that business school is one big cross-functional group project, right? Because you're constantly having to do that, whether that's in a study team, whether that's when you're working on an initiative for a club or organization, whether that's when you're engaging with other folks at your school's community. All of those experiences in business school definitely were critical to how I showed up and did that before COVID, but were even more critical in COVID because it was all virtual. I think another thing that was really important was dealing with uncertainty. When you think about the MBA education, right, and you think of something like the case method or just case studies in general, right? And for those who aren't familiar, it's oftentimes, while Harvard Business School and Darden are generally the two schools that really rely solely on the case method, most MBA programs use cases in their classes. And usually in the case, there's a summary of the situation, and at the end of it, you're kind of given the task of making a decision of what should happen. In a lot of cases, you're given some information, but it's incomplete, and there's some uncertainty of what there isn't always a clear answer. I think we've all had to deal with uncertainty over the last 6 to 9 months, and so in the classroom, getting those experiences, but certainly other types of uncertain environments that you are in business school, like when you're taking a stretch project or when you're doing something outside your comfort zone. All of those things matter to how you show up in this COVID world, where we all had to do a lot of things that we probably never thought we would ever have to do before. And so I think that was really key. And then maybe the last thing is just empathy. I think I'm someone who's always had a keen sense of empathy, but you get a greater sense in an MBA environment, I think, when you're exposed to people of different backgrounds, of diverse walks of life and things. And it really, I think, if you do business school right, it really gets you to be much more thoughtful and curious about where people are coming from and who they are. And that notion of empathy, I think, has been really critical and really important, particularly in these times when you can't always be face to face with someone and to see their body language or to know exactly what's going on. Or if you're working cross function with people you've never met before and you have to try to build relationships. So I think those are the couple of things that really stand out from my time at UNC and in getting an MBA that have been valuable to navigating this past year.
Great answer. Thank you. Thank you very much. How could your MBA education have better prepared you to deal with and adapt to a crisis when the unexpected and unanticipated? There's no way that we could have anticipated this, okay, or what's happened and the length of time that it's taken and everything that's going on. And it demanded immediate
Yeah.
change and adaptation. Is there anything that you kind of look back and say, gee, I wish they would have done this? Maybe there should have been a class or a series of lectures in crisis management, anything like that?
It's a good question. So I'll take this from the lens of a curriculum lens, and I'll take this from a lens of me personally in business school. So I'm
Okay.
going to start with the latter first because it's top of mind. So from me personally, I think something I could have done, something I've always said, and I know other people feel this way too, have gone to business school. It is probably one of the safest places you can be to take risks and to put yourself out there and to do things that are either risky, are antithetical to what you would normally do, or just completely outside of your comfort zone, which are all, I think, real feelings that many of us have felt over the past 9 months. And so for me, something maybe that could have prepared me a little bit more is really pushing myself to take on more of those experiences. I definitely took on some, but if I had a great experience, I don't think I would trade it for the world. But if you had said to me, Al, what could you have made your experience 10 or 15% better if you could have found something? It would have been to really force myself to be in those uncomfortable or difficult or uncertain kinds of experiences.
Like what?
Sure. So I taking harder classes that are clearly outside of my comfort zone. I think that's an easy low-hanging fruit. It could be raising your hand to lead the project when you don't necessarily feel empowered to do so or fully empowered to do so. It could be honestly being in class and pushing back on someone else's opinion in a respectful way versus kind of letting it slide. It could be actually starting or pursuing an initiative or idea on your own. I mean, I think I did quite a few, so I don't know what else I could have added just from a pure time perspective. But the general notion of it, though, I do think I could have maybe pushed myself a little bit more, because now I can certainly still do those things, but the cost is a little bit more than it is when you're in an environment of higher education. I think from a curriculum perspective, I think about some of the challenges that my classmates or friends are having or have had to face and solve for over the past couple months. And so I think about my friends who are working at, ride hailing platforms or delivery services, who have had to think about, how do we provide our employees or contractors with a safe and empowering employee experience during these kinds of times? Or if I think about my friends who have had to make decisions that have potential negative externalities to certain populations of people that they've never had to make before, I wonder how much better equipped they could have been had they gotten a curriculum that exposed them to businesses or industries or companies that are focused on solving these problems or challenges, or focused on serving these customer segments or populations and the like. Because if I think of anything we've seen over the past year is that, unfortunately, the divide between the haves and the have-nots is continuing to rise. And like I said, we've all been affected by COVID, but there's been certain groups clearly that have been affected significantly more than others. And so I wonder what a better experience, a better curriculum could be that is more inclusive, that is more representative of addressing issues and challenges that businesses should be thinking about if they're not, or have had to think about, so that if this were to come up again, they would be much more prepared to tackle it because of what they learned in business school.
Interesting point. I like the fact that you did not assume that I was asking strictly about the curriculum, that you also took some personal responsibility in terms of what you made the experience to be. So that's something that caught my attention as you were speaking.
Yeah, well, it's funny because this is the time of year that I do, certainly goal setting for the next year, but also I'm doing my own kind of performance evaluation at work and whatnot. And, speaking candidly, like one of the pieces of feedback that I have gotten several times in my career, and it definitely came up this year, was you don't always speak with confidence, or you don't always raise your hand when we know you know what to say or what to do, but you're afraid to say it. And so the question is top of mind, and it is something that I'm still working on and thinking about. But again, as I kind of reflect back on the question that you asked, and I think about business school and what is unique about it, It is the fact that you can try and you can fail and it's okay. And if anything, it's an incredibly supportive community to fail in, because they'll pick you back up and they'll also give you feedback on how you could do it better. And
That's right.
it's not that I don't have that at work. I certainly do. And I'm very grateful for it. But I can't think of a much better place where you could have that than in your MBA. So it was a good question, but it also was top of mind for me.
Well, good. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. It was a great answer. Now, in MBA School, the podcast, you interview many MBA grads, mostly, I think some students, but mostly grads, right? And what are some of the common threads you see in those interviews, specifically relating to the overall value of their education? As they look back on the MBA experience, are they glad they earned the MBA?
Yeah, I think they are. And I mean, you could probably say that there might be a little bias in that, acknowledge that there might be a little bias in that, considering they made a pretty significant investment and want to make sure they make good on it. But I believe when they talk to me and they say things, that what they're saying is real. I think one of the most commonly used words when I talk to students and alum is this word of transformative, right?
Right.
And you can use that in so many different ways, but I do think it is transformative for many of them, because particularly for many of them are in their careers, right? If you're thoughtful and hardworking and smart enough to get into a top MBA program, you've clearly had some level of success in your career to date. But for many of them, what they got from the MBA enabled them to make a step change or to accelerate or to zig or zag to a different path. And without that experience and the skills or experiences they gained from it, they would not have been able to do otherwise. And so the word transformative comes up quite a bit. I think that there's also this acknowledgement that when they gain the MBA and they go off into the real world, I mean, yes, there's the hope that you remember how to do a pro forma from your accounting class, or you remember the 4 Ps of marketing and whatnot. But what they also are glad about and thankful for is the ability to be able to learn how to learn. When you're in business school, you're constantly being, particularly in the first year, or particularly in that first semester, you're constantly getting thrown into situations where you're going to have to quickly absorb some content or material or some concepts and then apply them in a rapid manner. And that really can be challenging, but if you can get through that and learn that, that can be a very valuable skill to have. And so, sure, the hope is that they remember the 4 Ps or how to do a pro forma or whatever other concept. But the other thing that kind of comes up is just this thankfulness that they have the ability to, if they get something that they don't know how to do, how to size it up, how to think through it and break it down, and then how to go and figure it out. And then I would say the last thing that I often hear is, I think the analogy I like to use is that they get a toolbox that goes with them for the rest of their career. And in that toolbox, I mean, everyone always starts their career with a toolbox. But what an MBA does is that number one, it sharpens some of the tools that you already have in that toolbox, right? And then number two, it expands the toolbox and gives you more tools that maybe you didn't have before. And that will be another thing that often goes with them for the rest of their career, right? And not only that, but it gives you reps to sharpen tools, and it gives you reps to try new tools out. So I think those are probably a couple of the main reasons. And then the obvious one too is the network and the relationships, right? And that's well documented and kind of speaks for itself. Oops.
Do you discuss the application process with them at all?
Yeah.
What's the most difficult part of the application process for most of them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'd be curious.
Is there a thread? Is there a common thread?
I think there's a couple things, and I'd be curious to know what you think, because you live and breathe this each and every day. But the two that come up the most, one is tactical and one is strategic. The strategic one is why, right? Why an MBA, right? And it's kind of like the concept of simple but not easy, right? So it's a simple question, right? 2 words, but it's not always easy to
It's
come up
Harvard's,
with the
it's
answer.
Stanford's second question.
Right.
Well, no,
Exactly.
that's actually it's why Stanford is Stanford's
Sure.
second
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
But
Why
okay,
Stanford or why any other school? Because if it's not
right,
coming up in the essay, it's coming up in the interview. Right. There's some variation
and
of
it's in
that.
the back of their minds as they read it.
Sure. Right. And if you also, if you can't answer that question, you know, and certainly we can talk about this at some point, but it's hard to really craft sometimes a good story and application, because it is so critical to making the case to go to business school, but also to justify the cost of it. Right.
Absolutely, absolutely.
More of a tactical one. Maybe this is just a bias of myself, but I do think that even as I know that there are more testing options that are out there now, particularly if you've been out of school for a few years, I don't know. I mean, there's a few people out there, but if you were to ask me of like, hey, could you find me 10 people who say they love taking standardized tests? It would take me a while to find those people.
They probably run test prep companies.
Exactly. No, exactly. So, and it's not to say that they can't, you know, if you get into top business school, most people figure out a way to do it, but you know, I have heard more people say to me, you know what, the application or answering the essays was hard, but you know what, it was also a good reflection process. Right.
Right.
I have heard far less people say to me, you know what, I'm really glad that someone forced me to take a standardized test on top of
Right.
working all these hours. So I would lean towards that. But no, I mean, I would be curious to know when you work with clients, you know, what do they say to you, or what do they complain about or have angst about?
Well, I think the angst is definitely the test.
Yeah.
Angst, you know. Now there is a subsection, especially if English is not a native language, or
Fair.
they did not go through the U.S. educational system, where they're going to say that it's the essays that cause them the most angst. But I think for most people, it is the test. Okay, except for, you know, people who are good test takers.
Sure.
And then in terms of, I mean, I think you've really, and your guests, to the extent that you're quoting your guests, I think you're also right that question of why do you want the MBA? What do you want to do with it afterwards is probably the biggest or the most common strategic flaw, and that they really don't know.
Right.
Now, many people come in and they really do know, they have it down really well, but other times it's like, oh, I just know I want to go to Harvard, or I just know I don't like my job, I want to go get an MBA, I'll figure it out while I'm there. And that's a major mistake.
Right.
I'll never forget, I was once giving a presentation at a consulting firm, and I was the point of that particular talk was the importance of the post-MBA goal. And I'd been talking for maybe 40 minutes and emphasizing that you have to have a post-MBA goal, what it should be, how you should articulate it, why it's, you know, just, I've been going on for a while. And one fellow raises his hand at the end and he says, you mean to tell me that if I don't have a post-MBA goal, I shouldn't apply? And I said, yes, it's exactly what I'm saying.
Yes.
You know, good. You got it.
Nailed it. Yeah.
You know, but the guy was really surprised. He was shocked that I would be making this argument, or that I had this thesis.
Yeah.
And it's so important in terms of the admissions, in terms of how you're going to make the best of your MBA experience once you get there. Doesn't mean you can't change your mind. It doesn't mean you can't pivot if some opportunity presents itself. But it's very different from being a broken weather vane, just spinning.
Totally. And I think what I have witnessed, and I'm not sure how you see this, but what I have witnessed sometimes is that I think sometimes there's a little bit of lost in translation and a little bit of mixed messaging, in the sense that, number one, like clearly, like there is that question of what are your short and long-term goals, or what is your post-MBA goal? But then when you're an applicant and you're talking to students there, or you're going to a prospective students weekend, and you know, you go and talk to a student and they say with the best of intentions, oh, you have time to explore, right? Or
you can make it up, you can fake it. You can fake it.
Or
I faked it, you can fake it.
Yeah. Or like, I really use this time as a time of exploration. And I think many of those insights are maybe real and well-intentioned, but I think sometimes prospective candidates kind of get in their head with, oh, okay, well, they didn't have it figured out, so I don't have to figure it out, right? Or, oh, they used it as a 2-year kind of chance to explore, and so I can do that too. And that, I'm not saying that's not true, but there's, if you were to ask any admissions officer, right, would you rather have a candidate who, for the sake of the application and where they are right now, knowing that the MBA is a transformative experience, but where they are right now, has a confident sense in terms of where they are and where would they like to go, versus a candidate who is coming to your school, is really smart, but wants to explore? I think a
And it's
lot of
clueless.
times, right, exactly. Like, it's clear what the admissions director is going to want. Now, that said, as you well know, as well as I do, once you get to school, the whole point of it being a transformative experience is that sometimes things can happen, and that's okay. But that still doesn't mean you can't, to your point, have that weather vane to at least get you going in a direction, giving you some kind of way to navigate without being entirely lost. But there's nuance in that, or there's mixed messaging that sometimes I think applicants lose sight of, that sometimes complicates it a little bit more. So,
And I remember talking, I don't remember which admissions director it was, but I remember talking to the admissions director once, and I raised this point with her. And she said, look, the fact that you developed a career roadmap for yourself, a logical career roadmap, including our program that makes sense to us, means that even if it changes while you're in business school, you can do that again.
yeah. Yeah.
And the fact that and if you can't do that, we don't have the confidence that you can do it again.
Yeah. Yep.
So, that was the kind of the other point that she made. Getting back to your interviews with MBAs, do any of them tell you what they did to make the most of their experience? Again, is there any kind of common thread that you hear in your interviews on
Yeah.
MBA school?
Sure. I'll give a couple examples, and I actually do think I have not only examples of these, but also give a shout out to a couple schools to make it more
Okay.
real. So the first one is this idea of applied learning, right? And so one of the things that's great about business school is that you're in the classroom, but then you also have other avenues, whether it's extracurricular activities, whether it's consulting projects, whether it's working with startups, whether it's doing research with a professor, whether it's all these other things where you can take what you're learning and be able to apply it in real time. So an example that kind of comes to mind is the MBA Plus program at the University of Texas, Austin McCombs MBA program, which is a great program where, a lot of these schools have these, consulting like projects for real companies
Sure.
that are out there, where you get to put on a team and you learn real world skills. It's a chance to take what you've learned in the classroom and apply it into the real world. And so I think that makes it stick. It gives you a real example of what this work could be like. But oftentimes when I talk to students and I ask them, what helped you in your summer internship? A lot of them will talk about programs like the MBA Plus program and others, because a lot of the skills you build there are very real. And then the other thing I think in this time, what is also kind of unique and special is that for programs like MBA Plus or MAP at Ross, a lot of these projects they're getting right now, these companies are dealing, the companies that are signing these projects, these are real challenges that they're facing in this COVID world. So they're getting real experience trying to navigate some of these challenges that are literally just popping up. And so that ability to take what you learn in the classroom and apply it to solving a real and relevant problem with a business, I think is really valuable. I think another one is just the surrounding of programs, resources, and experts. So I think about giving a little shout out to my alma mater, UNC Kenan-Flagler, but they have a program called the Adams Apprenticeship Program. And this is for folks who are either wanting to be entrepreneurs or wanting to be early stage investors. But it's a full-on program where if you get accepted into it, not only is there a whole curriculum to work on projects that are related to the path that you want to go down, but then you get access to a network of experts who are already doing the thing that you want to do. And so not only are you pairing real world experience with something, but you're also getting access to people who are already doing that thing and can provide that expert guidance and coaching and network to help you grow in that way. And then the last one is just the leadership opportunities that come with it. I mean, I think if you're going to a top MBA program, I think the assumption is that you want to be a leader of some sorts, right? Whether it's within an organization, whether it's your own organization. and the like. And I think that there's a lot of great schools out there that just have both formal leadership opportunities as well as ones that just kind of, emerge. And one example just comes from, I just spoke to a student who's a second year at Gosweta Business School. His name's Willie Sullivan, but Willie is the managing director of the John R. Lewis Racial Justice Case Competition, which just launched this year. But Willie had this idea of, why can't we create a case competition that addresses kind of the intersection of racial justice and businesses? And took it to his professors, took it to the administrators, and they said, this looks like a great idea. Run with it and build it and bring it to life. And working with a team, that's what he's done. But when I was talking to him, one of the things he talked about was just, this was something that was an idea that turned into something, I think, that maybe he didn't even realize would come to fruition. But through it, the biggest challenge for him has been stepping up to the plate and leading his peers, oftentimes his peers. But it's also the same thing. That experience is so incredibly valuable to what he's probably going to have to do when he goes into the real world and goes back into the working world. And so there's applied learning, those resources and programs with experts, and then the leadership opportunities. I think those are the things that people value most, and kind of inherent is that certainly is the relationships you build, the alums you meet, the classmates you get to, in normal times, get to travel with, and all those other things. But I think those are the things that kind of stand out, but trying to give some real tactical examples so people can kind of envision what those could be like. Yeah.
Again, thank you. Very good answer. Now let's turn a little slightly different direction. As you know, this looks like, and we've discussed it, this looks like a record year for MBA application volume. Do you think MBA applicants should refrain from applying because of the intense competition this year?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I kind of treat this question very much how I think a lot of successful companies think about themselves and the market, right? And their competition.
Okay.
So those successful companies, I mean, they pay attention to the market. They pay attention to what their customer or their competition is doing. But what they're mostly focused on is who they are as a company, right? And ultimately, like, their customer. And so it's not that those other things don't matter, but when you start dictating or you start marching to the beat of what the market says or what your competitors say, you lose sight of your own North Star, your own vision, your own strategy. And using that analogy, I would encourage applicants to kind of think about that. It's important to understand the implications, as we've talked about in my podcast before, about the banner year it is for applicants, and it probably will be a little bit more competitive. But as I think you always say, if you have a reason for getting an MBA, if an MBA right now aligns to what your career goals are, that's the most important question that you need to answer and think about. And pay attention to what the admissions statistics report said. Like, yeah, that's a dose of reality that you need to think about. But I really do think it starts with yourself and really focusing on yourself and your own kind of goals. And that would be the advice that I would give to others as well, is pay attention to what's going on in the market, but think first and foremost about what's going on internally with yourself, because that's what matters the most.
And making yourself as competitive as you possibly can.
That too. That too. And I think the other point, which is inherent in focusing on yourself, and this is a good life lesson, there's going to be things in life that you can control, and there's going to be things in life that you can't control. How many applicants that decide to apply to HBS is something that you cannot control, right? And so you can worry about it if you want.
But it's not going to do you any good.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. Do you have any suggestions for how applicants can respond to or adapt to the increased competition? I mean, concretely.
Sure. So I think it's a couple things, right? I think that, and again, drawing on the analogy of a successful company, the successful companies out there, they know themselves, but they also stay in touch with their customer, right? And they're very clear about who their customer is, what their challenges and pain points are, and how their service or product can solve them. And kind of using that analogy, I think that an applicant could kind of think about that in the same way, right? Of knowing themselves incredibly well, who you are, what you bring to the table, why you want to get an MBA and how an MBA from that school is going to help you in your career. But on the flip side of that, doubling down and knowing your customer. And in this case, the customer is the school you're applying to, right? So knowing what they look for in applicants, being very specific about how that school or how that community, by you being there, is going to be better, right? Because that you're there and what you really bring to the table and what you have to offer them, right? Just like a good product or service would do the same, for their customer. And concretely, I mean, I think it really does kind of go back to, and obviously this is going to really be just digital in this environment that we are in, really taking the time when you can to really get to know those schools and those programs and doing your research. And not only doing your research, but asking the right questions, the thoughtful questions that are going to yield you insights that are going to help you really refine and hone in on internally and externally how you are a fit for that school. Because I think everyone knows, like, yes, like I should read the accepted blog or listen to the podcast and hear about what's going on, or they know that they need to look at the rankings and all those things, or they know they need to reach out to the admissions team or whatnot. But I think where the gap sometimes is really making sure you're asking the right questions that yield you insights that can help you tailor and refine, how you position yourself in your application. And so I think concretely, if people can focus on that, I think that will, and then take what they've learned from that to refine their overall package, that's going to make them unique and differentiated. Just like, again, a good company will be unique and differentiated from their competitors by doing the exact same thing.
That's great. That's great insight. Thank you. Now, do you have any tips for MBA applicants looking ahead to apply in the 2021-22 cycle or even later? Like
Yeah,
what do either what do some of your interviewees wish they would have done
sure.
a year and a half or a year before they matriculated, or 2 years before they matriculated? And what do you feel now that you wish you would have done?
Sure. Well, I think it really, I mean, there's some tactical things, right? So if you're curious about an MBA, go and there's never like there's it's never been easier to find something on the internet, right? So
That's for sure.
go to MBA school, or go to accepted.com. That's a great starting point. I mean, very tactically, sure, do that. But I think that one of the things that I often hear, and I'm glad you brought that up, one of the things I often hear from MBA students and even alum is that, oh, I didn't know if that was even a career, or I didn't even know that was a thing, right? And certainly that makes sense, right? Like, you don't know what you don't know, particularly, again, with where most folks are when they apply to business school for full-time programs, right? It's like you've done a couple things, but there's a whole world out there that you don't know yet. And so how do you discover the world that you don't know? Well, it's through research, it's through exploration, right? In terms of going out and looking at the resources, talking to people when you can, and learning about some of these paths and fields. I mean, I think any good professional, a good activity is, if there's something that is curious to you, is going out and finding some folks who do that thing and learning more about what it is, why they show up to work and really enjoy doing that every day, and how they got to where they got to. And so I think those are still things that really apply. But I think maybe the tactical, and the other thing I would say is, like, if you think that's a kernel, that's even a kernel of thought, start now. Like, start now, because it will take time. But the tactical thing that I can urge people to do is, and I just learned this, so I'm still practicing it, but I'm going to share it in case it's helpful. It's this idea of asking yourself, finding a question and asking it yourself, that same question every single day for a period of time, and writing down your answer. And so perhaps if you are thinking about applying next year, every day for the next 2 weeks, write down the question, why do I want an MBA? And write down your answer, and do it every single day, and see what happens. I think a lot of times what happens is that you may think that, like, oh, I just need to ask it once, but the first time you do it, it's going to be kind of vague. The second time you do it, it's going to be a little bit more specific. The third time you do it, the fourth time you do it, and so on and so on. I think you get closer to it. And also you start to...
That assumes that you're doing some research during those 2 weeks.
Fair point. But assuming that you have a thought about applying next year, hopefully this is part of the preparation plan. But or even if you're earlier in the stage in the cycle, start with what does success look like in my career in 5 years, right? or what do I want to do next? I pick the question, but ask yourself the question and write down the answer, and see what comes of it. Right. I think it could be a really valuable exercise to maybe help you think about, okay, what's next? And then if once you get a good answer, and assuming that you're thinking about the application process, hopefully that feeds your wine MBA, because
Right.
if you are going to apply, you will definitely have to answer that at some point.
Or maybe answer it for 2 weeks now and then put it aside for a couple of months,
Sure.
continue your
And then
research
see.
and do another 2 weeks in
Totally.
2 months or 3 months or something like that. That's an interesting idea. I've never heard that suggestion. I never thought of it, but it's a very interesting one.
Yeah.
It's also very interesting how writing something down,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, I think even more so than typing. I don't know if you literally meant taking a pen. I understood that
I
you
agree.
did.
I think you should, because to your point, and sorry to cut you off, but I think to your point, the act of writing it down, and there's research actually that has shown that uh, writing something down versus typing basically writing notes versus typing notes, people remember more when they write. So I would encourage folks to write down, because I think it just makes it more real.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Last question. What would you have liked me to ask you?
Great question. I would say that this question, would I have liked, going on the same notion, because you've been really good about asking me about, what are people talking to you about when you interview them. It would have been interesting if you would have asked, what is business school like in 2020 or 2021, right? Just because
Okay.
it
Or how has it changed since you graduated?
sure, yeah, that too.
Okay.
But even just the notion that because of COVID and because business schools are located in different states and different countries, um, a, a product that is usually somewhat consistent is different, because it has to be, right, because there are some places that were hybrid. There were a lot of places that were mostly virtual. There are some places where you literally get tested once a week to be able to
Right.
go to campus. There are some places where you can sort of still meet up with your classmates outside in a park, and other places where you can't. And I think that's what's been interesting to me, is that talking to folks from different programs. I mean, there's some components that are somewhat similar, in that virtual is very much an element of pretty much every program,
Oh,
but to
yeah.
what degree it is different. The other things that are kind of interesting is that I think there are definitely some schools that are out there. I think Berkeley comes to mind as one of them, where because they did have a robust digital education delivery kind of mechanism, the classroom experience is a little bit more differentiated than simply just Zoom. And so that is not the same at every school, though. And so that is a difference that we probably would not have been talking about at all if COVID didn't exist, right? Because outside of that,
I think Harvard also has that. I think Harvard is
yes, you're
also in
right.
that.
You're absolutely right. And not only that, but Harvard, and then some more schools have done this now. I think Stanford's done it, a couple others now, where they've also invested in essentially proctors or teacher support to help kind of moderate the class. But that was something that's different and unique. Um, the way in which schools are doing kind of their city treks are different, right? And so it's very common to, for a lot of folks, maybe in the fall or the spring, to go and do a trek to the San Francisco Bay Area to go meet all the tech companies and all the VC firms. And certainly that can't happen. And so there's been some interesting kind of ways in which schools have tried to, do that digitally. Another thing that's very different this year, conferences, right? Most schools
Oh, yeah.
student clubs put on conferences. On the downside,
Online.
they can't meet in person. On the upside, they can drive up registration and attendance, because anyone can go. And so that would be the question. And those are some of the thoughts that come to mind just based off some of the conversations that I've had.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. It was fascinating. And of course, that is the the paradox of COVID.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, I think most of us would rather not have had this experience, but it has driven innovation, and all that we may suffer from Zoom fatigue, we've also been able to participate in and attend and talk to and meet people that we otherwise wouldn't have done. Now, you and I probably would
Yeah.
have had this interview because I was
Sure.
doing this before COVID, but
Sure.
and so were you for that matter. But there were so many other things that people would not have participated in
Right.
uh, from where they were. There's certain celebrations, maybe attending a wedding virtually that you would not have attended in person. And then
Sure.
there are people who would have attended in person who, you
Sure.
know, You know,
Wouldn't have,
so
yeah,
it's just it's such a paradoxical kind of situation.
yeah,
But it is interesting how the schools are responding differently. Northwestern, I think, because their facility is so big, they've
sure,
been open, they've been in
yep,
person most of the time.
yeah. And to your
So there's
point,
really runs quite a gamut.
yeah, and to your point, and on Kellogg, they did a really good job, from what I've been able to understand, of really involving students in the process
Yeah.
for how they were going to deliver this experience for the year. And that is another unique differentiator. But what I was also going to say is, I think it speaks to something that we talked about earlier, in that, look, you're right. None of us really wanted this, but
No.
there's things that you can control and there's things that you can't control. And once the cards are dealt, you kind of you have two choices: sulk or make the best of what you have. And to your point, despite all the challenges that this brought on, like, there were opportunities to be had. And there are some really great stories of students, faculty members, administrators really stepping up and finding unique and innovative ways, and really embracing the constraints to innovate and to find ways to get the most out of the experience. And so it's not ideal. None of us wanted it, but there are still some positive outcomes that have come from it.
It's true. It's very, very true. Al, I want to thank you. We're just about out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining me. Where can listeners find you online?
Yeah. Thank you, Linda. It's always a pleasure to chat. I really always enjoy it. People can find me at mbaschool.com. They can check out the blog, as well as they can check me out on the MBA Insider podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Either of those two places are a great place to start.
Thanks again. And we're going to link to MBA Schooled as well as to Al's book, MBA Insider, How to Make the Most of Your MBA Experience, from the show notes at accepted.com/404. Listener, thank you too for joining Al D and me for Admission Straight Talk's 404th episode. If you find the show worthwhile, I have a favor to ask. Please tell your friends about the podcast. Your doing so helps us spread the news about Admission Straight Talk. And a quick reminder: master the paradox at the heart of graduate admissions by downloading our free guide, Fitting In and Standing Out: The Paradox at the Heart of Admissions. Grab your copy. It's a free copy at accepted.com/FISO for Fitting In, Standing Out. Thanks again for coming. This is Admission Straight Talk, produced by Accepted, and I am your host, Linda Abraham. I'll talk to you again next week.